Hello, my name is Caleb Benedict, and I'm here today to talk about gentrification and why gentrification is in fact an ethical issue. So, what is gentrification? Gentrification is a process of renewal and rebuilding accompanying the influx of middle class or affluent people into deteriorating areas that often displace poorer residents. That's a definition straight from Merriam-Webster. And for a less brief and concise and a more specific definition, I'm going to refer to a portion of a research article written by Peter Marcuse in the Journal for Urban and Contemporary Law. This definition is: gentrification occurs when new residents who are disproportionately young, white, professional, technical, and managerial workers with high education and income levels replace older residents who disproportionately are low income, working class, and poor, minority and ethnic group members, and elderly, from older and previously deteriorated inner city housing in a spatially concentrated manner. That is, to a degree differing substantially from the general level of change in the community or region as a whole. So gentrification is essentially the shifting of a group of socioeconomic individuals who are in that same socioeconomic group. So what's the history of gentrification? This history here that we can see, this is a concise history, very summarized, and is most specific to the United States. However, some of these tendencies can be found in other parts of the world. So gentrification came about mostly because of these four things. Through my research, I've learned quite a bit, and it all came down to essentially abandonment or white flight. White flight was a term used essentially for abandonment that occurred after World War II when large numbers of middle class families moved from the inner cities and into the suburban areas. This caused a decay of sorts in the inner cities. Redlining. Redlining was an unethical lending practice that prevented home mortgages from being lent to specifically low-income and minority groups in specific areas or neighborhoods that were literally outlined in red on maps of neighborhoods and communities where bank and financial institutions would not lend to certain individuals within that area. And then urbanization. Urbanization, in this respect, is essentially the opposite of white flight or abandonment. Urbanization is the process where large numbers of individuals relocate to the inner cities for reasons such as being proximate to employment opportunities and then other attractions that cities may offer, such as restaurant scenes or a different sense of community. It's essentially just a thriving area that has become attractive to people to live in recent decades. And then displacement. Displacement came lastly, and displacement is what many of us think of when we think of gentrification. And it's essentially individuals being forced to relocate from their neighborhoods, and this is often caused by either sharp increases in rent, increases in home prices, and or property taxes and cost of living that follows. So let's talk a bit more about abandonment and white flight. Peter Marcuse, in that same article written in the Journal of Urban and Contemporary Law, wrote that abandonment and gentrification both are reflections of a single long-term process resulting from the changing economy of the central city. Essentially, this occurred because there was an economic change that happened in these inner cities, causing some people to leave because some people chose to move in. Now, white flight is the departure of whites from places such as urban neighborhoods or schools, increasingly or predominantly populated by minorities. Here's an excerpt from Jennifer Blakesley, who wrote an article in the Institute for Research on Poverty in 1979. So over the past 2 decades, the plight of America's cities has become almost commonplace of social comment. while city tax bases are eroding and their job markets declining as companies seek cheaper, newer, or more accessible facilities in the suburbs. Their schools and services struggle against the combined impact of inflation, unemployment, and shrinking federal assistance. So the inner cities suffered because of this. The cities are seen increasingly as deteriorating ghettos for the poor, the underemployed, and the disadvantaged, and above all, for minorities. It had some pretty negative impacts, this movement of abandonment and white flight. And then redlining is a truly unethical practice of lending that specifically targeted minorities and low-income minorities in certain areas of certain cities. According to the Business Dictionary, usually unlawful discriminatory banking or insurance practice whereby those living in or doing business in certain poor or allegedly bad neighborhoods are either denied credit or insurance or have to pay higher than normal rates. This is targeting and this is discriminatory. And then urbanization. We can all think of what urbanization is, and it's essentially what a lot of us have probably done, myself included. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I came from Idaho. So that's essentially urbanization. The house that I'm filming this in is a house that was built 4 years ago and was built on top of a piece of property that an individual sold to a developer. According to Merriam-Webster, the process by which towns and cities are formed and become larger as more and more people begin living and working in central areas. I myself live and work in downtown Portland, Oregon. And then displacement. Displacement is, according to Peter Marcuse, as a result of each of these developments, the poor are displaced. He's talking about certain patterns that led to gentrification. They are displaced when businesses desire to move in because the land is too valuable to house them further. So people are displaced because a business chooses to purchase out the property where maybe their apartment complex is located. They're displaced when gentrification takes place because the buildings in the neighborhoods are too expensive for them. They're displaced because they can't afford market rate rent. And they are displaced when abandonment takes place because the buildings in the neighborhoods are unsuitable to provide decent housing for them. This is the dark side of gentrification. Because in fact, gentrification does at times benefit individuals, such as people who sell their properties to developers for large sums of money. But unfortunately, there's another dark side. There's the unfortunate displacement. There's even the extreme tenant targeting, tenant abuse, or tenant neglect, which is essentially property managers, landowners who are renting, so landlords, treating their tenants in such a way that might motivate them to leave or break their lease sooner than later so that they could turn around and turn a profit. It's unfortunate. This is an excerpt from Jennifer Blakesley, who was in fact an attorney in New York City and represented many tenants in tenant lawsuits. Many landlords in gentrifying neighborhoods have a strong financial motivation to deregulate stabilized apartments to increase rent, or may seek to remove undesirable tenants so that wealthy white families will feel comfortable moving in. Thus, they resort to harassment and baseless evictions, directed primarily at tenants of color. These acts clearly conflict with the guarantee of legal security of tenure and violate the right to adequate housing. Evictions in these cases may be justified or unjustified, but they can threaten legal security of tenure. Essentially, some of these tenants in these extreme sick cases are disrespecting and are not abiding by lease agreements. Examples of gentrification: rent seems to increase, property values increase, income oftentimes decreases because things like manufacturing jobs are replaced by other types of jobs because the land where maybe that plant was located is going to be used for something else. These can all lead to some types of displacement. Here's a visual provided by the Journal and the nonprofit Enterprise Community, which showing since 2001 there's been a steady increase in renter housing costs and a steady decrease in overall renter income. Here's another visual aid by the same organization showing that since the 1960s there's essentially been a steady increase in the burden for renting households. Let's talk about the ethics. We can probably already determine some of these ethical issues. It's unethical to redline. It's unethical to target specifically low income and those who are considered minorities for certain lending practices. And it's unfortunate and wrong to act in ways that would be considered tenant abuse or targeting just to turn a quick profit. It's unfortunate. So cities and communities can do a few things to help mitigate these unfortunate consequences or side effects of gentrification. And already, many of these things are being practiced in our local cities. At the federal level, the Fair Housing Act was enacted, and according to the Housing and Urban Development website, the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination when they are renting, buying, or securing financing for any housing. The prohibition specifically covered discrimination because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and the presence of children. This prohibits redlining, essentially. Conditional development zones. These are zones identified by municipalities that specifically control what type of development can happen within these zones. Expansion zones are zones that local governments identifies to help promote development in certain types of ways, such as affordable housing. And they'll entice developers to do these things by doing things like waiving permit fees and offering tax subsidies. A very common way to help fight gentrification is to protect and to promote affordable housing. Affordable housing is just what it sounds like. Housing that is less than market rate rent and thus more affordable. Housing trust funds are funds used to promote and develop city-ran affordable housing. Exclusionary zoning areas are areas where affordable housing must be developed if any type of development takes place. And then there's such things like tax relief for those who maybe can't afford the property tax burden, and so they can offset it with a waiver of sorts. And so to conclude, gentrification is definitely an ethical issue. This is a free market doing its job, essentially, supply and demand taking effect, and trends moving and changing compared to trends set 50, 60, 70 years ago. However, there's a right way to take this process and deal with it as a community and as an organization. Ethical lending practices should be done, not unethical lending practices. Tenants should understand their rights and be able to keep their rights and to avoid tenant abuse and targeting by landlords and property managers that want to evict them before their lease is up. Things like this are what make gentrification an ethical issue. And by keeping some of these things in mind, hopefully the negative side effects of gentrification can be avoided. Thank you very much, and here are my sources.